In the fall of 1848, as demolition crews began tearing down the long-abandoned St. Mary's Academy for Young Ladies in Salem, Massachusetts, they stumbled upon something that would cast a long shadow over the town's legacy. Hidden beneath the chapel's floorboards, inside a sealed, lead-lined box, were 47 small leather-bound journals, each labeled with a different girl's name. The contents were disturbing, pages filled with personal accounts of unimaginable abuse. But what truly shocked investigators were the detailed client logs records, listing names of prominent men from New England's political and social elite. The state of Massachusetts swiftly sealed the documents, citing public safety concerns. Those records remain classified to this day. What you're about to hear comes from testimonies never intended to surface, notes that powerful families tried to erase, and the deathbed confession of a woman who held onto this story for 60 years. If you're someone drawn to the hidden parts of history, especially those others work hard to keep buried, this story is for you. But be warned, what happened at St. Mary's challenges everything we think we know about virtue, power, and innocence in 19th century New England. Salem in 1811 was a city trying to move past its dark history. The witch trials of 1692 still hung over the town's name, and Salem's leaders were eager to reinvent their image as a place of piety, discipline, and progress. It was during this period of reform that the Fairfax family arrived, bringing with them prestige, wealth, and a plan that quickly won over the local elite. Victoria Fairfax was a commanding woman, tall, refined, with piercing gray eyes. Born into a wealthy Virginia plantation family, she had received a top-tier education and had even studied abroad. Widowed at 32, after her husband died in a yellow fever outbreak, Victoria decided to devote her inheritance and her life to the moral education of young women when she proposed the creation of St. Mary's Academy, offering free education to poor and orphan girls alongside tuition-paying students. From prominent families, Salem's religious leaders embraced the idea. The school would teach academics, music, French, needlework, and most importantly, moral values rooted in Protestant beliefs. The building she chose for the school had its own unsettling past. A grand three-story mansion built in 1787 by a wealthy merchant, it had stood empty for years after its original owner's death. Locals believed it was cursed families who tried to live there left quickly, blaming strange sounds and a heavy, oppressive feeling inside the home. But Victoria dismissed the rumors and purchased the property at a deep discount. She quickly renovated, adding dormitories, a dining hall, a chapel with stained glass, and a top-floor suite of private meditation rooms for spiritual reflection. Helping Victoria run the school were two relatives. Her younger sister, Evangeline Fairfax, was a soft-spoken woman with a musical gift and a fragile demeanor. She taught languages and music and was often heard singing during chapel services, her voice so lovely it reportedly stopped workers in their tracks. The third key figure was Victoria's brother-in-law, Bartholomew Fairfax, a stern, towering man who had spent 15 years preaching across the South. He became the school's chaplain, delivering sermons warning against worldly temptation and the special dangers faced by young women. Parents, both alarmed and reassured by his intensity, felt grateful their daughters would be under such watchful care. The academy opened with great ceremony on September 15, 1811. Dignitaries attended, including Salem's mayor, state legislators, and a bishop. Victoria, standing on the front steps in black silk, promised to create a sanctuary of learning and moral strength for young women, safe from the corruption of modern society. The first class included 23 students, aged 12 to 17. Some paid a steep tuition of $50 a year, a significant cost at the time, but more than half came from poor or orphan backgrounds, accepted as charity students. Among them was 14-year-old Margaret Sullivan, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had died in a fire the year before. Margaret had been working in a textile mill when she was offered a place at the academy, free room, board, and education in exchange for light domestic work. She was bright, curious, and hopeful. Another was Priscilla Morse, 15, whose parents were gone and who had been living with an uninterested uncle. Serious and bookish, she was eager for the chance to study. Then there was 13-year-old Hannah Whitmore. Her father had been jailed, her mother had disappeared, and she was living in the town poorhouse when Victoria personally invited her to St. Mary's. For the first time in months, Hannah had something to look forward to: a bed, regular meals, and the chance to learn. These girls arrived with gratitude and high hopes. None of them could have guessed what lay ahead. The promises of protection and guidance were a fade. The grand old mansion would soon become a prison, one some of them would never leave. The first signs of trouble came not from the students, but from Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a seamstress who regularly delivered clothing to the school. Living just downhill, she had a clear view of the building and came by often. One morning in October 1812, a year after the school opened, she arrived early and noticed a group of well-dressed men leaving quietly from the academy's side entrance, the one that led to the private third-floor chambers. They moved quickly, kept their faces low, and entered carriages that waited in the shadows. Mrs. Thornton was puzzled. The pattern continued. Over the following weeks, she noticed carriages arriving after dark, sometimes just one or two, sometimes more. The men were discreet, but their expensive vehicles and polished appearances suggested they were wealthy and well-connected. More disturbing were the changes she began to see in the students. Once cheerful and lively, many of the girls grew silent and pale. Through the windows, she saw them moving slowly, their eyes distant. Some bore bruises or cuts usually explained away as accidents from sewing or chores. Margaret Sullivan, once so eager to chat, barely spoke at all. Her vibrant red hair had dulled, and she had a haunted look in her eyes. Mrs. Thornton suspected she was trying to communicate something but couldn't. Then came the night of December 13, 1812. Unable to sleep due to a cough, Mrs. Thornton stood at her window in the early hours, making tea from the academy. She saw flickering lights in the third-floor windows, unusual, jittery lights like torches or small fires. Then she heard something chilling, muffled screams coming from the chapel. The sounds came in waves, sometimes stopping, then starting again. They lasted for nearly an hour. What she heard was unmistakably human, filled with pain and fear. By morning, she told herself it must have been her imagination. But 3 days later, on her regular delivery, she was told that Hannah Whitmore had died suddenly on the very night Mrs. Thornton had seen the lights and heard the screams. Victoria, dressed in black, claimed it was a fever. The funeral was small and private, held at the school. No relatives attended. Hannah was buried out back, beneath a plain wooden cross. After that, other students began to show signs of decline. They were quieter, slower, visibly unwell. Victoria explained that intensive study and moral training could be hard on girls from difficult backgrounds. Some need more adjustment than others, she said. But Mrs. Thornton couldn't shake her doubts. She started taking note of which girls were deteriorating. It was always the poorest ones, those with no family, no money, and nowhere else to go. The paying students still looked relatively healthy. Then in February 1813, 2 more deaths. Priscilla Morse, the quiet reader, was found dead in bed. Just days later, Mary Catherine O'Brien died after a short illness marked by seizures. Both were buried on the school grounds. Their deaths were signed off as natural by the academy's physician, who also happened to be Victoria's cousin. Mrs. Thornton felt trapped. She had no proof, just observations, and who would listen to a seamstress over a respected figure like Victoria Fairfax. Still, the memories stayed with her. The light in the windows, the screams, the transformation of girls who'd arrived full of life and hope. Something terrible was happening behind the grand facade of St. Mary's Academy. Something no one in Salem was willing to see. It would be many years before the truth finally surfaced, and when it did, it was far worse than anyone had imagined. By the spring of 1813, a heavy stillness had settled over St. Mary's Academy for young ladies. It was as though the building itself had absorbed the grief and secrets buried within it, radiating a silence that seemed to muffle even everyday sounds. 3 students had died in the span of just 4 months, casting a shadow over the school, but daily life went on, as if these deaths were simply unfortunate events rather than Signs of something deeply wrong. Victoria Fairfax carried on with what many described as impressive composure. Rather than mourning, she leaned into the role of spiritual guide, often speaking of suffering as a test of faith and insisting that hardship was preparation for eternal reward. Her sermons became more intense, focused on themes of sacrifice, obedience, and submission to those appointed by God. Young ladies, she would say from the chapel pulpit, her cold gray eyes scanning the room, your former lives filled with poverty, neglect, and moral confusion have left stains on your souls. Only the strictest discipline can cleanse them. The students learned to keep their expressions neutral during these sermons. They understood some from subtle cues, others from direct punishment that any sign of emotion or curiosity was unwelcome. Girls who asked too many questions or drew attention to themselves were assigned grueling chores, scrubbing floors with harsh chemicals, working outdoors under the sun, or spending long, silent hours in the third-floor meditation rooms to reflect on their failings. Margaret Sullivan, now 15, was no longer the lively girl who had first arrived at the academy. She had learned to hide her thoughts and emotions behind a carefully blank expression. But beneath her quiet exterior, she remained observant. Over time, she started noticing troubling patterns. Certain students were regularly selected for what Evangeline Fairfax called special instruction held in the third-floor chambers. These sessions always happened at night, after dinner, and lasted until late. When the girls returned, they moved sluggishly, with that same vacant stare Margaret had seen before in Hannah, Priscilla, and Mary Catherine. Margaret also began connecting these sessions to the late-night visits from unidentified gentlemen in unmarked carriages, always arriving at the side entrance that led directly to the upper floor. During the day, all visitors entered through the main entrance and were welcomed in the parlor, where their visits were formal and supervised. But the men who came at night did not follow those rules. Margaret noticed another troubling detail. Girls who had attended these special sessions more than once began showing physical symptoms: loss of appetite, constant headaches, and fatigue. Some developed a subtle hand tremor, not unlike Evangeline Fairfax's. When asked about these changes, Dr. Edmund Fairfax, also the school's physician, dismissed them as signs of spiritual sensitivity, claiming the girls' growing weakness was evidence that their souls were becoming more attuned to divine influence. The academy's daily schedule left little room for the students to rest or connect with one another. The day began at 5 a.m. with chapel, followed by a meager breakfast. Lessons stretched from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., with only a short break for a thin soup lunch. Evenings were taken up by long religious lectures from Bartholomew Fairfax, where girls sat silently as he read from carefully chosen religious texts. Speaking or asking questions wasn't allowed. It was an exhausting routine designed to isolate and control. Attempts to pass notes or whisper during class were met with severe punishments that quickly silenced further efforts. Still, small bits of information began to circulate among the girls, passed through eye contact, subtle hand signals, and coded remarks during group activities. Margaret became a quiet leader in this covert communication network. She had survived longer than most, and younger girls looked to her. Through whispered exchanges and shared observations, she learned that the special instruction involved more than extra lessons. Some girls described being given odd-tasting tea that made them feel dizzy and confused. Others recalled wearing white garments that felt more like burial clothes than school uniforms. They took part in strange rituals involving candles, incense, and prayers in languages they didn't understand. Even more unsettling were the accounts of the visiting men. Well-dressed, clearly wealthy, and always composed, these men had a chilling presence. Their polished manners and refined speech clashed with the hunger in their eyes and intensity that made the girls instinctively uneasy. They didn't just watch the ceremonies, they participated. Sometimes they joined the prayers. Other times, they simply sat and observed, yet always with a quiet authority that suggested they were far more than passive guests. As winter turned to spring, Margaret came to understand the true danger they were in. This wasn't just a school running on strict religious values. This was something far worse, a system designed to strip away the girls' sense of self, and ultimately, their lives. The signs were clear. She and her classmates were growing weaker, more detached. Margaret herself had started experiencing the same symptoms: trembling hands, constant tiredness, and difficulty focusing. But she refused to give up. After surviving poverty, loss, and hardship, she wasn't about to quietly disappear. As the months passed, she began planning. If escape was impossible, she would find another way to make sure the truth came out no matter the risk. The school's carefully maintained image was about to face a real threat. That opportunity arrived in the fall of 1813, when a new teacher, Miss Constance Hartwell, joined the staff. Miss Hartwell wasn't a student. She had been hired to teach advanced mathematics and natural philosophy. This alone marked a major change. Until then, the Fairfax family had handled all instruction themselves. But Miss Hartwell was different. Just 24 years old, she was the daughter of a successful Boston merchant and had received an exceptional education at Miss Willard's Female Seminary in Troy, New York. Her schooling had encouraged open discussion, analytical thinking, and a belief in women's intellectual potential. She had taken the job for both practical and personal reasons. The pay was generous, more than any other school in the region, and she saw it as a chance to help underprivileged girls access education. Her father wasn't thrilled about her decision, thinking she should be focusing on marriage, but Constance was determined to carve her own path and convinced him that teaching was a valuable pursuit. From her first days at the academy, she noticed things that didn't sit right. Her students were clearly capable but strangely passive. When she asked questions meant to spark thought, they responded with rehearsed answers, as if they were afraid to think for themselves. No one asked questions. No one volunteered ideas. In her experience, young women were naturally curious when given space to explore, but here, curiosity seemed to have been trained out of them. At first, she assumed this was the result of the school's intense religious atmosphere. She had grown up in a devout household and understood the value of moral teaching. But as the semester went on, she began to suspect something deeper was happening. One turning point came during a math lesson in October. A 16-year-old student named Sarah Piton, normally quick and attentive, was struggling to focus on basic calculations. Her hands shook, and she seemed lost halfway through problems. When Constance gently asked what was wrong, Sarah hesitated, then spoke softly. "I'm sorry, Miss Hartwell," she said, glancing nervously at the door. "Sometimes my mind feels cloudy, like there's a fog inside. Dr. Fairfax says it's because my spirit is being purified. But I remember thinking more clearly before I came here. First glance images of suffering, domination, and rituals that clearly deviated from anything resembling Christian instruction. The students entered next, all dressed in flowing white gowns. Their movements were slow and unsteady, and it was clear to Constance that they had been drugged. Among them was Margaret, who, despite her obvious disorientation, scanned the room with a flicker of recognition and awareness. She was trying to remain present. Then came the clients. Well-dressed men filed in and took their places in chairs, arranged along the edge of the room. Some were older, others young and sharply groomed. But they all shared a disturbing stillness and watchfulness. They spoke quietly, occasionally smiling or nodding in acknowledgement of one another. As Evangeline moved among them, offering the cups from her tray, they accepted them with familiarity, as if this had become a regular ritual. What followed was a choreographed series of actions, blending liturgical structure with something darker and theatrical. Victoria stood at the front, reciting words in a language Constance did not understand. The men responded in unison, their voices low and deliberate. The girls stood in the center, swaying slightly, their eyes vacant. Then, a signal was given. The clients rose and began to approach the girls individually. Constance's heart pounded as she realized what was about to happen. She could no longer deny the truth. These sessions were not religious ceremonies, but orchestrated exploitation. Every part of the academy, from its structure to its discipline, was built to maintain this operation. Constance stayed as long as she could, watching in silence, tears running down her face as the horror unfolded below. She took mental notes of everything: who participated, what was said, the sequence of events. Every detail mattered. Every second she remained there increased the risk of being discovered. But she knew they would never get another opportunity like this. Finally, when the gathering began to wind down and the men started filtering out through the side entrance, she slipped quietly from the closet and retraced her steps down the servants' staircase. Her limbs trembling, she made it back to her room undetected. The next morning, she met Margaret in the laundry corridor during a scheduled chore shift and relayed everything she had seen. Margaret listened with a tight jaw and nodded silently. Now they had what they needed. They began copying records, taking pages from the ledgers and letters, hiding them inside books and behind loose wall panels. Constance used her contacts in Boston to start sending the evidence in coded packages to a former classmate at Miss Willard's seminary, someone she trusted to understand the gravity of what she was receiving. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that suspicion was growing. Victoria's questions became more pointed, her glances sharper. One evening, Margaret's bedding was stripped and her belongings searched under the pretense of looking for contraband sweets. Nothing was found, but both she and Constance knew it was a warning. By early March, Bartholomew Fairfax began lecturing about traitors and the dangers of prideful women who sought to challenge divine order. Though no names were mentioned, the intent was unmistakable. The noose was tightening. Still, Constance and Margaret pressed on, determined to gather enough evidence to bring down the academy from the outside. They knew time was running out, and that one mistake could cost them their lives. But now that the truth was in their hands, silence was no longer an option, and hidden documents combined with the physical evidence she'd smuggled out finally convinced a senior officer to take action. Within hours, a warrant was signed, and a team was assembled to raid the academy before anyone inside could destroy the records or disappear. As Victoria, Bartholomew, and Evangeline were led away in shackles, a strange stillness settled over the building. Constance and Margaret stood side by side in the corridor, both stunned and relieved. The nightmare was finally ending, though neither woman felt anything close to peace. There would be questions, trials, and no doubt a wave of public disbelief once the story came to light, but the truth had been dragged into daylight. In the days that followed, the academy was shut down and sealed as a crime scene. Investigators uncovered more hidden documents, secret rooms, and even a network of tunnels beneath the building. Dozens of former students were tracked down and given the chance to tell their stories, many for the first time. Some were too traumatized to speak, while others came forward with testimony that helped build the case against the Fairfax family and their associates. Margaret was hailed as a hero, though she refused the spotlight. She returned quietly to the home of a Quaker couple in Salem who had agreed to take her in, determined to rebuild her life in peace. Constance, meanwhile, was offered a position with the governor's Education Oversight Committee, where she used her experience to help develop new standards for the licensing and monitoring of private institutions across Massachusetts. Neither woman ever forgot what they had witnessed inside the walls of St. Mary's Academy. The memories remained vivid and painful, but also a reminder of what they had survived and what they had fought to stop. In the end, they had refused to stay silent, and because of that, others would never have to live through what they had endured. Listen. When Margaret handed over her detailed testimony, along with a list of high-profile clients scheduled to visit the academy that same evening, the authorities had no choice but to act. That list included judges and legislators, people whose arrests, if caught in the act, would create a public scandal too big to hide. It was this chance to expose such powerful figures that finally pushed law enforcement into motion, despite their usual hesitation to confront well-respected institutions. As the Fairfax family was taken into custody, the entire operation they had built began to unravel quickly. That same day, constables arrested Dr. Edmund Fairfax at his private office, while other officers secured the academy's records and spoke with surviving students. The powerful men who had supported the academy now faced exposure, as their names appeared in seized documents and witness testimony that could no longer be suppressed. One of the most critical breakthroughs came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, once dismissed as a working-class seamstress with an overactive imagination, She had quietly been keeping notes for over 2 years. Her records included strange nighttime activity, odd lights in the chapel, and the steady decline of the girls she saw during her visits. Her testimony matched what Margaret and Constance reported, offering the kind of independent, detailed observations that turned suspicion into undeniable fact. The woman once ignored became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The trial of the Fairfax family became one of the most talked about legal cases in Massachusetts history. It revealed not just individual crimes, but a system of abuse that had flourished under the protection of wealth, reputation, and social status. As investigators worked through the mountain of documents and survivor interviews, the full scope of the operation came to light. By the time the investigation was complete nearly 6 months later, it had revealed a deeply organized system that had operated undetected for close to 3 years. In total, 43 girls had died, not from natural causes, as their death certificates claimed, but from deliberate poisoning meant to dispose of those who could no longer be used or who posed a risk to the operation. That the trial began in September 1814 and lasted 7 weeks. Newspapers across the U.S. and even Europe followed it closely, framing it as a case study in how moral decay could thrive under the surface of respectability. Victoria Fairfax tried to claim she was merely a victim herself, pressured by men around her, but the evidence said otherwise. Her own ledgers and letters showed that she was the mastermind behind nearly every part of the operation. Bartholomew Fairfax argued that he'd been performing misunderstood religious rituals. That argument collapsed when experts confirmed that no known Christian doctrine resembled the ceremonies he described. Instead, it became clear that the rituals were fabricated to provide a false sense of spiritual legitimacy for what was, in reality, abuse. Evangeline Fairfax's role was more tragic. Medical tests showed that she had been consistently drugged for over a decade, leaving her mentally impaired. Her involvement in the ceremonies wasn't voluntary, but rather the result of long-term conditioning. She had little memory of what she'd taken part in. As for the wealthy clients who visited the academy, their fates varied. Some were forced to resign quietly. Others avoided legal consequences altogether by using their influence or destroying evidence. Still, at least a dozen men lost their careers permanently. Dr. Edmund Fairfax was sentenced to 20 years in prison for his role in covering up deaths and providing medical support to the operation. His conviction sent a clear message: professional titles would not protect those who enabled abuse. Victoria and Bartholomew Fairfax were both sentenced to death. Victoria became the first woman executed in Massachusetts for non-witchcraft crimes. Their hangings were carried out on November 15, 1814, in front of a crowd of over 2,000 people, many of whom had traveled great distances to witness the end of what the press called the most twisted criminal enterprise in American history. Margaret Sullivan was praised across the country for her bravery. Newspapers called her a symbol of moral strength and resilience. She used the attention not for personal gain, but to push for better protections for vulnerable children. She went on to open a school in Boston that offered free education to girls from low-income backgrounds. Over the next 30 years, her academy educated hundreds of future teachers, nurses, and reformers. Constance Hartwell returned to Boston after the trial. She married a fellow educator, and together they opened a school built on the principles of inquiry, integrity, and accountability. She spent the rest of her life working to ensure that schools would never again operate without proper oversight. The original building that housed St. Mary's Academy was torn down in 1815. The land was eventually turned into a public park, and a simple memorial was placed at its center. It listed the names of all 43 victims and bore a quiet but powerful inscription. They were forgotten by the world, but not by history. The scandal prompted immediate changes in how schools were regulated. Massachusetts became the first state to implement routine inspections of all educational institutions, especially those serving vulnerable populations. Other states soon followed, and those reforms laid the groundwork for the modern system of educational oversight we have today. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was what it proved: that even the wealthiest and most respected individuals can be held accountable when the truth is backed by courage and evidence. The Fairfax trial showed that justice, when pursued with integrity, can pierce even the strongest walls of privilege and secrecy. The story of St. Mary's Academy is a stark reminder of how easily institutions meant to protect can be twisted into tools of exploitation. It shows us how cruelty often hides behind a mask of virtue and how the bravery of a few can make a difference for many. As Margaret Sullivan said during her testimony, they thought we were powerless because we were poor, because we were young, because we were alone. They thought they could use us and discard us without consequences. But they forgot that even the powerless can find strength when they stand together for the truth. Even now, more than 200 years later, we're still grappling with many of the same issues, ensuring that institutions serve the people they claim to protect, and holding the powerful accountable when they don't. The girls who died at St. Mary's were silenced, but their story lives on. It reminds us that the cost of ignoring evil is always higher than the risk of confronting it. Their voices, recorded in testimonies and documents, still speak today. They ask just one thing: remember us, learn from what happened, and don't let it happen again. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who values the deeper side of true crime, the kind that explores power, corruption, and justice. Like the video if you believe these voices from the past deserve to be heard. Subscribe for more stories that uncover what history tried to hide. And tell us what you think. Could something like this still happen today, hidden behind respectability and authority? Let us know in the comments. We read and value every perspective.